All right, Crim 1, let's get into Chapter 8, where we're going to start talking a little bit about the courts and the court system in the United States. If I can get it to move. Jurisdiction. Okay, I can't remember if we actually talked about this in this class or not, but when we're talking about jurisdiction, we're basically talking about the court that has power over whatever the particular issue is. So let's say, for example, I'm going to get divorced. Would I go to a criminal court for that? No, I wouldn't go to a criminal court for that because the criminal court doesn't have jurisdiction over a divorce. A family court would have jurisdiction over that. So that's all we mean when we're talking about jurisdiction. Which court has the power to hear or address whatever the particular issue is. All right, so we have a dual court system in the United States. We have state courts, and then we have federal courts. In the state courts, regular state crimes are tried, and that's the vast majority of the cases. Your normal street crime or things that happen within the city of Fresno, most of those are going to be cases that will be heard in the state court. Okay, I'm gonna go back here real quick because the state courts, let's say, for example, you go down to Fresno County and you are convicted of a DUI, but you are the defendant and you don't think you had a fair trial. So you want a higher court to look at that issue. You have the ability to appeal, to file an appeal, and basically have a higher court or the next step up take a look at your case. If the appellate court looks at it and they say, yeah, you know what, we agree with the state court, so no, we're not going to change anything, you have the right to go all the way up to the state Supreme Court and have the state of California Supreme Court address the issue. So there's a hierarchy within the court system. Yeah. So you can kind of see down at the very bottom here, we're typically talking about the municipal courts. This is, or criminal division, blah, blah, blah. You have your trial courts. This is your regular old court in downtown Fresno. State appeals court and state Supreme Court. Okay, so if you have an issue in this court, you can appeal it, it would go here. If you still don't like the issue or the answer, you can go here. The highest court in the land is the United States Supreme Court. And that is where you go after a failed attempt at the state Supreme Court. I don't know if that makes sense. So each state has their own Supreme Court, and then the United States Supreme Court is the court that has a final say. Federal courts, they have jurisdiction over, I know this is going to be a tricky one, federal crimes. Okay, so we are talking about criminal behavior that violates the federal law as opposed to just a state law. And let me just, as an example, I went out into the parking lot at City College and I stole a car. I'm going to the state courts for that. I go out into the parking lot at Fresno City College and I steal a mail truck. That's going to be a federal offense because the United States government runs the United States Postal Service and I have stolen a federal vehicle. Okay, makes sense? So in the federal courts, we have federal crimes. Same kind of deal. I know this is a much more complicated picture, but federal courts kind of go the same way. You can be heard in one of the district courts. If you don't like what happened, you can appeal it and go up to a circuit court of appeal. And then if the issue still isn't resolved, they can go up to the United States Supreme Court, which is, again, the highest court in the land. Probably something I might ask on a quiz. So there are other kinds of courts. I'm going to kind of skip through all this, but there are courts, martial law, courts, military courts is what I'm trying to say. There are tribal courts, so some of the Indian tribes do have their own courts, and then courts for people with special needs. We also have drug courts. These are pretty common in the United States right now, and you're dealing specifically with drug offenders and trying to offer them rehabilitation. Reentry courts, teen courts. There's all kinds of different courts. This is a teen court. Some of you might have had this, what we called youth court at your high schools. All the high schools in Fresno County, I believe, have youth courts where students would actually sit in and be the jurors in a court proceeding. And the benefit to it was that the offender would have the case dismissed and sealed when they were done. So it was a diversion type program. Appeals, we already kind of touched on this a little bit. If you have an issue with something that happened during your trial, you do have the right to have a higher court look at the case. I have seen instances before where people, attorneys, judges, have literally fallen asleep in court. That's kind of a problem. So if you are the defendant and you get convicted and the judge fell asleep during the middle of your hearing, you might have grounds for an appeal. So appeals, oral arguments, there's more appeals. I'm not going to ask you a whole lot about these, so that's why I'm kind of skipping through. But if the higher court, the appellate court, thinks that the lower court made a mistake, they will send the case back. And that is called remanding it. When they remand the case, they send it back to the lower court to fix the issue. We're going to kind of go through this quickly. You can slow this down and read it, read everything. Judge in her courtroom. Yes, there are some female judges, of course. So courtroom work group. This is a really hard word for me to say. Try and say that 3 times really fast. Courtroom work group. But you have judges, prosecutors, and defense attorneys. These are the big players in a courtroom. And I've worked in a courtroom before because I was fortunate enough to be kind of the fourth wheel over here, which was probation officers. These people work together every day. If they have a good working relationship, it's awesome. If they have a bad working relationship, it can be really ugly. So what is a judge's job? Basically, when the judge walks in, certain judges want everyone to stand and acknowledge them. Others are a little bit more informal. We have the word recusal here. A judge should recuse his or herself if they know someone involved in the case. Like, say, for example, I'm a judge and my husband gets arrested for something and I'm the judge with power over his hearing. That's a really bad idea. So I would need to recuse myself and say, hey, I know this guy. I should not be the judge in this case because there's a conflict of interest. So the judge's responsibility is to make sure that the rules are followed and due process is followed. They have all these other... They're supposed to be in control. It's interesting when you go working in different courtrooms, different people have control. Some of them, some courts, the judges are in control. Some of them, it's the bailiff that's in control. Some of them, it's the clerk that's in control. And so it's really an interesting dynamic, but the judges are basically responsible. Blah, blah, blah. There's a bunch of different kinds of judges. Some of them are appointed and some of them are elected. The vast majority are appointed. The judges, like, say, for example, Fresno County courts, they are appointed by the governor or they're voted in by us, the voters. This just talks about what you have to have or be in order to be a judge. Typically, you should be an attorney. I think you have to be a lawyer if you want to become a judge. But anyways, that's a little bit about what we just talked about. I'm skipping. Are there issues with judicial selection, with people being appointed by a governor or a president? Of course there are. Politics come into play here. Because a governor or a president is going to appoint someone who's like-minded. So if you have a really, really conservative governor, you're going to have a lot of really, really conservative judges. If you have a really, really liberal governor, you're going to have a bunch of really liberal judges. Unfortunately, I would like to say that politics does not play a part in it, but it does. It plays a significant part, and that's kind of one of the big issues. There have been only 2 African-American U.S. Supreme Court justices, and only 4 women so far. So a lot of you will look at that. You'll see the makeup of the United States Supreme Court, and it's a bunch of really, 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 number one, really old people, but mostly really old white men. Yeah, politics. Judges, unfortunately, some of them will bring their own beliefs into the courtroom as opposed to just strictly following the law. So a prosecutor, what is their job? This is going to be like your district attorney. Prosecutors, their job to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the offender has committed that crime. I'm just going to kind of go through here. Yep. Doo-doo-doo. I'm still here. I'm just kind of skipping through this. You can read that. Defense attorney, what's their responsibility? To defend the defendant and to protect his rights. And this is all the other stuff they do. Now, you can have a private attorney or a public defender. A public defender is supposed to be for indigent defendants, meaning they don't have any ability to pay, but most people do use the public defender's office, even if they are not indigent, as this says. But this is kind of a long, boring story, but you know what? I'm going to tell you anyways. Let's just say, for example, I get arrested with my husband, my daughter, and my son. And it's time for us to go to court. We can't all have an attorney working for the same office because that would be a conflict of interest, because I'm going to roll over on them and I'm going to try and blame them. So you can't have attorneys that work for the same office fighting each other in court for their defendants. So you have to find an attorney from a different office. So if there are 4 of us, the judge might have to just appoint a private attorney to some of us, because we cannot all be represented by the public defender's office because there's a conflict of interest. Okay, that's kind of what this is saying. Again, it works really well when public defenders, defense attorneys, and judges work well together and have a good working relationship. And I've seen excellent outcomes when this has been the case, and I've also seen horrible ones. So just kind of depends on the courtroom work group. So who else is in the courtroom? Juries, witnesses, victims, and then other participants. Things like media. Oops, didn't mean to go there. Media, maybe interpreters, you name it. There's all kinds of other people in the courtroom as well. This one's a little bit more complicated. A grand jury and a petite jury. A petite jury is just a regular old jury, like we would think of, where 12 people are going to decide whether a person is innocent or guilty. A grand jury is a little bit different, and honestly, in our area, not that common. But a grand jury is a group of citizens who get together and decide whether or not there is enough evidence to go forward with a trial. So these two are actually different things. The petite jury, or just your regular jury, they're the ones that are going to decide beyond a reason. They're going to say, you know, we vote to convict. The grand jury is not involved in deciding whether or not a person is innocent or guilty. Their only responsibility is to decide whether there's enough evidence to go forward with a trial. Did I already skip that? No. Okay, jury. Any of us can get chosen as a juror. You have to be a U.S. citizen, over 18, and of average intelligence. I don't know what the heck that means, but anyways. And how is that chosen? If you have registered to vote, have a driver's license or California ID, and or pay taxes, they will find you and you will get a jury notice. A lot of people really do not like being on juries. I can say I was chosen on a jury once and it was really boring, but you know, I had to do my thing. It is possible for an attorney to say, you know what, I don't think you would be a good juror for this case, and ask you to be excused from the jury. If you would imagine, you know, as a probation officer, I wasn't the right kind of peace officer, so I still I was still eligible to be on a jury, and I actually got chosen. And I was kind of frustrated with the attorney because I would never have thought that I would have been a good juror in his case, because of my what would appear to be bias in favor of law enforcement. So I asked him after the case was done, and he told me, you know what, it was a loser case. It didn't really matter. So it was really sad. Kind of gave me a negative whole thought about the court system. And, let me go back here. You all probably know who Dr. Phil is. So Dr. Phil, in his previous life, what he used to do, he was a jury consultant, and he worked for defense attorneys on choosing the best jury for the defendant, in favor of the defendant, and that is completely legal. I don't know, interesting job. Witnesses, there are all kinds of witnesses. Lay witnesses are people who actually witnessed the crime. And then expert witnesses are people who have some sort of specialized knowledge about something that happened in the crime. For example, a fingerprint expert. The fingerprint expert was not there for the crime. He did not see what happened, but he's an expert on fingerprints, so he's allowed to testify about fingerprints. A subpoena, right here, I know you like it. There's no way that's spelled right. Yep, that's spelled right. A subpoena is an order from the court to appear in court. So if someone gives you a subpoena, you are ordered to appear in court. If you do not appear, you could be held in contempt of court and go to jail. Eyewitness testimony is really bad. And we would have done a little experiment in class, but obviously we're not in class right now. But I've done this before where I had someone get up and leave in the middle of class, and then I asked everybody in the classroom who just left. And it was really interesting. I mean, the answers were all over the place. So eyewitness testimony is rough. Victims can be in court to a certain extent, kind of depends on which part of the court proceedings it is. And if it's a juvenile case, sometimes the victims are not in court. But anyways, victims can be in court and typically will have the right to speak at the sentencing hearings. That's it. Yay, we made it.